We need to have a chat. My neighbor Dave, he and I actually tend to see, we agree more than we don't on the election in 2020. But as I've admitted to him, I'm very dogmatic when I say it wasn't a stolen election. Because one, it keeps people looking at the past. Two, it feeds grievance. And three, and this is the nuanced point, it's actually a very technical matter here, where the election was not per se stolen in the way you think of stealing. So I say the election wasn't stolen, and I have a lot of friends who disagree with me. And when they start talking about it, they find out we actually, to some degree, do agree. Although a lot of the stuff that they point out has been thoroughly debunked. There were not people overnight in Atlanta, for example, stuffing ballots. There were not proof of election machines throwing the race to Joe Biden that the hand count disproved. None of those shenanigans really happened. And the problem here is that so many people focus on the crazy stuff that really didn't happen. They've completely ignored the stuff that did happen. The election was not stolen on election night. What happened is the Republicans got outplayed in the courtrooms of America before the election even happened. Sun Tzu in The Art of War said, win the battle before it's begun. That was one of Sun Tzu's statements. Every battle is won before it's ever fought. Every battle is won before it is ever fought. The election wasn't stolen because the Democrats won it before Election Day. Now, I say all of this for this. Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani and others are probably going to lose their law licenses over what they did in 2020 with their crazy allegations. We'll get back to Sun Tzu here. Just bear with me here. I want to read for you part of the Washington Post. The Kraken is backtracking. The many dubious and false claims of voter fraud and irregularities made by the lawyers aligned with Donald Trump after the 2020 election have forced something of a legal reckoning. A legal reckoning that continues apace, and perhaps nobody exemplifies that like former Trump lawyer Sidney Powell, who has now been forced on multiple occasions to acknowledge that the Kraken wasn't what it was cracked up to be. Remember, she said the Kraken was coming. The Kraken was coming. She said Donald Trump won in a landslide and they're going to prove it. She's going to release the Kraken. Her exact words, I'm going to release the Kraken. They claimed that the Dominion voter machines were rigged and throwing the vote to Joe Biden. They claimed people were submitting, filling out absentee ballots and sliding them through machines. They claimed a lot of stuff with a lot of edited video that people who don't know anything about how elections are processed could believe the shenanigans. The problem is she's probably going to lose her law license because a lot of things that were claimed just weren't true. In fact, two of the experts relied on were not legitimate experts. One of them actually was accused of fraud for scamming people. Another one turned out to be, I think, an auto mechanic. He claimed to be some sort of computer expert. And this was just in Michigan. I want to explain to you all the things you say were the stolen election and how the election was stolen. It wasn't stolen on Election Day. This is Sun Tzu in The Art of War. The Republicans used to excel at this, and now the Democrats have bettered them. And this is all now coming to a head as these lawsuits are moving forward to disbar the lawyers who went out of their way to claim the election was stolen when the election wasn't stolen. What exactly is going on here? Let me break it down for you. Months and months and months before the election, We're talking a long time before the election. The Trump administration, in response to COVID-19, released guidelines. See, this is where a lot of people who want to claim that the election was stolen, they have to leave out this key point, because otherwise it makes it seem, well, the truth as opposed to the lie. The truth of the matter is that the Trump administration released guidelines on how to conduct elections in the event of the pandemic. Drop boxes, for example. Did you know that drop boxes were the Trump administration's idea? Drop boxes were the Trump administration's idea. Now let's take ballot harvesting. There are lots of allegations in Georgia about ballot harvesting. Ballot harvesting is against the law in Georgia. That's where people show up, beg you to give them your absentee ballot, and they cast it for you. They take your ballot to the drop box. There are credible allegations now that the Democrats were engaged in ballot harvesting. They were getting people's absentee ballots and then taking them and dropping them off, making sure that every Democratic vote got cast. That's wrong. But here's the thing. Under the law, the ballot harvester goes to jail, but the ballot doesn't get thrown out because the ballot's a lawfully cast ballot unless you can prove the ballot harvester himself filled it out, and nobody's shown that. What actually happened here is that months before the election, the Trump administration released guidelines. And the Democrats took full advantage of those guidelines, but they did something else as well. This is where all the nuance and the stolen election stuff gets lost. The Democrats out-lawyered Republicans in courtrooms across America. And part of the reason this happened, and you need to just accept this is true, members of the Trump administration alienated the standard Republican lawyers who fight this stuff. The standard Republican lawyers who fight this stuff, the Ben Ginsbergs of the world, they're very establishmentarian. The Trump administration went to war with the Republican establishment, and they alienated a lot of these really good lawyers who do election law. You cannot take a DUI lawyer and drop him into an election law case. I've seen it happen, and it doesn't work well. When I was a young guy out of law school, my very first case was an election case. I was an elections lawyer. I know election law in this country. I know election law in Georgia. In my very first case out of law school, I had not yet even gotten admitted to the bar, but my law firm let me go handle the case with some lawyers in the courtroom for me because I had not yet been admitted to the bar, even though I'd passed the bar exam. It was a case of a clerk of court for a superior court in Georgia who lost by about 19 votes. And I knew that you could not just find 19 questionable ballots and throw them out because there were a lot of people who didn't even vote in the race. It was a down ballot race. And there were about 100 people who hadn't voted in that race. So you needed 19, which was the margin of victory, plus 100. So you needed 119 people. And at the end of the day, the lawyer, who was not a elections lawyer, but was a lawyer out of Columbus, Georgia, who really didn't know election law, kind of learned it on the fly. He was a real estate lawyer. Well, he lost the case because he showed 19 people had inappropriately voted in the race, but you're not allowed to ask them who they voted for. You're not allowed to ask someone in court who they voted for. He showed 19 people voted in that race, and they shouldn't have voted in that race. And I stood up at the end of the case. I said, Your Honor, he's missing the other 100. Nobody in the courtroom understood what he was talking about or what I was talking about. And I said, look, it's a matter of law. You can't presume that these people voted in this particular race, and you can't presume that these people voted for a particular person. So you've got to show not just the margin of victory, but also the number of people who didn't vote. So in Georgia, for example, Joe Biden won with Georgia 11,700 votes, but there were 35,000 people who did not vote. So you cannot show me 11,700 ballots in the presidential race in Georgia and say this proves that Joe Biden really didn't win, because there's another 35,000 people who chose not to vote in the race altogether. And under the law of all 50 states, you have to take the margin of victory plus the people who didn't vote in the race together. So really, you've got about 50,000 people you need to show and cast out. And no one's been able to do that. It's a legal standard you can't meet. Therefore, you can't say the election was stolen, even if you think it was stolen. Words mean things, and to say stolen suggests there's a crime, and it's a crime you haven't proven. What actually happened is months and months and months before the election, the Trump administration put out procedures in place on how to conduct the election because of COVID, and Democrats ran to court with their very best election lawyers and gamed the system. And the Republican lawyers were so pissed off at the Trump administration's treatment of them, they said, screw you, we're not helping. And the result is they had to go get Joe Blow, DUI attorney, to go into court against the expert Democratic lawyers. And guess what? The expert Democratic lawyers, even in front of Trump-appointed conservative judges who love the man, the Democrats won. So by the day of the election, the path had already been set. The game was already up. The war had already been won. You won the battle before it was even fought on the Democratic side because you gamed the system ahead of time, and the best of the best lawyers on the Republican side sat on the sidelines and refused to even help the president because they were so mad at him. Burning bridges has real-world consequences, and the Trump team burned all the bridges with the best of the best election lawyers on the Republican side. So what happened? The Trump team could not admit it was their own pandemic guidance that the Democrats took advantage of. So here comes Sidney Powell with her Kraken, and crazy came with her. And they made all sorts of extraordinary claims, all of which have been debunked. From weird absentee ballots that had no creases, which have never been found, to staying late to stuff the ballot boxes, which wasn't true, to Hugo Chavez's ghost, the Iranians and the Chinese collaborated together to hack the voting machines. All these voting machines printed out ballots, and the ballots were hand counted. And it didn't help. They presented a theory of the case that allowed them to escape the blame. And now the consequences are coming. To quote Jeremiah Wright, the chickens are coming home to roost. Sidney Powell's legal team is probably going to have their comeuppance. Sidney Powell's legal team is more likely than not going to have her cases, well, all the cases have been thrown out, but she's probably going to be disbarred. And unfortunately and sadly, a number of lawyers who went to court to help Sidney Powell based on her theory of the case, they're going to be disbarred as well. A federal judge has issued a scathing indictment of their professionalism, pointing out that several of the experts you all relied on and believed because Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani gave you their credentials and how expert they were. Turns out they weren't those experts. They didn't have those credentials. They had lied, and Giuliani and Powell were moving so fast they didn't vet them and they got played. And now they're probably going to lose their bar license, along with some very good lawyers, a couple of whom I know, who tried to help them salvage their case, and they're going to get punished as well. And meanwhile, what do we have? In Georgia, we have a divided Republican electorate that is probably going to get Stacey Abrams elected unless they can unite behind Brian Kemp. In Nevada, you have a group of Republicans who are so mad about it, they may sit out, and the Republicans could win that Senate seat, and the Democrats may hold on to it because the Republicans are sitting it out. In Wisconsin, the Republicans are so fractured there, they could probably pick up seats in the state legislature, and they may stay home, because no one wanted to deal honestly with what actually happened with the election. Yeah, I'm dogmatic the election wasn't stolen, because when you say the election was stolen, you're talking about something you don't even understand. You think you do and you don't. What actually happened is the Trump administration put forward COVID guidelines months before the election. The Democrats went to court, had judges twist the wording ever so slightly. The best of the Republican lawyers stayed home and didn't even fight it. And so on election day, the game was already rigged. The chairs were already set out. The battle was already won by the Democrats. And what you had left were the crazies coming out and trying to explain things to avoid anyone having to own up to the fact that all of this was already done months and months before the election. The game pieces were already put on the board in a way that when you went to vote, the Democrats were able to take advantage of a system. But who actually designed the system? Donald Trump's Department of Homeland Security with their COVID regulations. And the result in trying to ignore all of this and in trying to ignore the facts is Sidney Powell's Kraken lawsuit, where she's probably going to go bankrupt in dealing with the defamation of what she caused. And a lot of good lawyers are going to lose their careers because they tried to help her out. There never was a Kraken. There never were these expert witnesses. And the Dominion voting system machines never were rigged to steal the race. And so many people will go to their graves believing otherwise instead of actually paying attention to what actually happened. Months before the election, lawyers got together. The Trump administration alienated his very best lawyers, and the Democrats had their way in the courtrooms and set the decks for the 2020 elections. The way to move forward is for the Republicans to move forward and fight in 2022 instead of relitigating 2020 as if somehow that will fix what's about to happen. The Republicans have the advantage now. They need to get into the courtrooms this time and stop the Democrats from being able to do what they did the last time.